I did not know our current president idolized Barnum as a child, but I drew some parallels between them while I was reading this book, so it's interesting to learn this. For example, Barnum had a super popular autobiography that he had written, and in 1858 he added on an address to it called The Art of Money Getting. Whose book title does that sound like? In his early adult life, Barnum was an alcoholic, and later in his life, he was one of the main leaders of the temperance movement. Who else do we know who doesn't drink at all? Barnum was also somebody who didn't care if he was telling the full truth as long as he profited off of it. And in 1888, at the age of 78, Barnum wanted to run for president. He wanted to go up against Grover Cleveland, and he went so far as to choose himself a running mate. But the Republican Party fell behind Benjamin Harrison instead, and he went on to win the presidency. Now remember, back then, the Republican Party was the less conservative party. One thing that really did surprise me about Barnum, though, is that he did not cheat on Charity. At least there are no records of it. There's no proof that he ever did. That is to say, physically cheat on Charity. Because he absolutely did emotionally cheat on her with a woman named Nancy Fish. Barnum had a friend in England named John Fish who had two daughters, Jane Ann and Nancy. And in 1870, Barnum invited John Fish to America, and John brought his daughter, Jane Ann. Barnum gave John and Jane Ann a grand tour of America that also included Cuba, and during this tour, John Fish was writing back home to his other 19-year-old daughter, Nancy. And for some reason, John Fish allowed Barnum to read the letters that Nancy was writing to him. Apparently, her letters were so moving that Barnum began to write her, having never seen her or met her before. John Fish and Jane Ann eventually went back home to England, but in 1872, Barnum invited John Fish and his daughter Nancy back to the United States. During this time, Charity Barnum was not doing well. For the last 2 decades, she had been sickly and kind of a hypochondriac, but by 1873, she was diagnosed with valvular heart disease. So she was diagnosed in March of 1873, and by September, Barnum was leaving the country again. He could not be stopped. And on November 20th of that year, he got a telegram that said Charity had passed away. Barnum was in Hamburg at the time and allegedly locked himself in his room for days, but that's his version of events, because that's the way he wrote it. I don't really believe it, because rather than go home to attend to Charity's funeral, he went to London to stay with the Fishes. He didn't return to the US until April 1874. And this is because he secretly married 22-year-old Nancy in private on February 14th, 1874. Just 13 weeks after Charity's death. How charming. Nancy would bear him no children, and later in her life, Nancy would also become sickly. How interesting that Barnum had healthy wives that became very ill upon being married to him for a long time. By the time she was 40, Nancy was in a sanatorium full-time, and she became famous by giving wives marriage advice in magazines. And let me just read to you some of the advice she wrote about. If you must be absent from him in those leisure hours in which Satan is said to provide some mischief still for idle men to do, it is not incumbent of you to provide for his solace a companion of the gentler sex, younger and fairer than yourself. And Nancy actually did eventually take her own advice. She persuaded a younger cousin of hers named Sarah J. Fish, who was unmarried, to accompany Barnum around the world as she sat in a sanatorium.